Hello and welcome to So What You're Saying Is, I'm Peter Whittle. Now, to call my guest this week a political YouTuber is rather an understatement. Carl Benjamin, who was known for quite a long time as Sargon of Akkad, is a phenomenon on social media with hundreds of thousands of followers. As well as his own YouTube channel, he also is host of lotuseaters.com. And he's with me now. Thank you so much, Carl, for coming.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
I must get something kind of cleared up. Lotus Eaters and also Sargon, these are steeped in classical illusion, are they not?
They are, deliberately so. I'm a big fan of ancient history, is the simplest way to put it. I find it deeply romantic and alien. It's so very different to the way we live our lives now, and we don't understand it. And so the modern view of the ancient world is clouded with our own presuppositions and our own assumptions about language and beliefs and relations between people that we are transposing onto them. And it's very difficult to try and separate yourself from that and get into the heads of those people. I mean, one of the classic questions I will forever have is, how did Hannibal persuade 100,000 men and 40 elephants to go across the Alps in winter to invade Rome? I mean, invading Rome is a suicidal prospect at the best of times, and they knew that at the time. It sounded ludicrous, but somehow he got a city to move across in the tremendous difficulty, the unbelievable prospect of death laying before them, with the expectation that they would win. And I'm just, there has to have been something much deeper going on in the way that they viewed the world. Yes. Because I, as a modern 21st century man, was like, well, I'm never going to do that. That's lunacy.
But what can we get from, I mean, what do you get from it? I mean, I know you just, it's fascinating and it's sort of expansive, isn't it? And outward. And that's what is attractive about it. But, you know, because I think possibly a lot of younger people don't know much about this history. And I noticed with you on Lotus Eaters, you actually do a lot of podcasts purely about ancient history, don't you?
Absolutely. We try to also cover those topics that aren't in the mainstream, because if you go to Hollywood and ask them, well, what about history? You hear about the Roman Empire and Caesar and the fall of the Republic, and that's pretty much it. Or you might get the Battle of Agincourt, if you're lucky, or you might get Napoleon. And it's like, okay, that's interesting, but very narrow. And history is actually much broader. And one of the things that we learn from history is the range of human experience is far greater than anything we have now. In fact, one of the things that I think Britain can pride itself on is actually civilizing ourselves and a large part of the world to the point where we don't have to go through these kind of trials. Because as much as I might be romanticizing them in my own modern way, there was a huge amount of suffering, a huge amount of endurance and just grit and determination to carry almost any of it through. I mean, one example is the Persian invasion of Greece. Xerxes built a bridge across the Bosphorus, across what was called the Hellespont. And just the description of how the bridge was built, it was boats lashed together that was then covered in earth, covered in reeds, and then covered in more earth, in order so that he could march thousands of cavalry across. And that's an unbelievable endeavor.
Yes.
That's unbelievable. You know, and if someone were to task me with that, oh God, I wouldn't know where to start.
Was this something that you liked as a kid?
You know, not particularly. It was actually in my early 20s that I got into it, after I'd left university. And I looking back now, I wish I had been interested in it when I was young, and I would have done a history degree at university and things like this. But I didn't know what I wanted to do, and I just kind of stumbled upon this, and I found a deep love for it.
Well, when we were talking earlier, before you came on, we were talking a little bit about ancient English history. And I mean, this is a very hazy, for someone who talks a lot about English, it's a very hazy area for me. But I mean, particularly you were talking about Alfred. And this, I find this fascinating. I mean, what is it exactly?
One thing I really like about Alfred the Great is that he was a scholar before he was anything else. And he is a fascinating character, and he very much had events thrust upon him. Wessex being the last of the English kingdoms to fall, the Vikings had taken the rest. And one thing that comes out of there is actually surprising. There's a compilation of poems and essays, and I suppose we'd call them poems, from the English history called the Essex Book. And I posted a copy of this fairly recently, actually, and I just read through all of them, even the ones that are overtly religious. I'm a child of the 90s, so I'm an atheist, and I've been raised in a materialist culture, and so it's difficult for me to be able to believe in God or anything like that, and I don't think I ever will. But I don't feel I have a loss there either. I don't have a part of me that misses that, but I do find myself romanticizing our traditions and history here. And I think there is actually a great deal of good there, and there's a remarkable amount of consistency. Alfred doesn't sound like he's writing from 1,300 years ago. He actually sounds surprisingly modern. And one thing that I find fascinating is how he is taking responsibility for what's happening to England at the time. He blames the Viking invasions on the English becoming loose with their morals and failing to follow the correct path as laid out by God and Jesus. And so what Alfred does personally is translates the Bible into English at the time, Old English obviously now, but English at the time, and then sends these copies of the Bible around the country. Now, that was something that started the Protestant revolutions, was it not, in the printing press? This was a revolutionary idea, and Alfred did it 1,000 years before it happened on the continent, because he just thought it was the right thing to do.
Yes.
The average Englishman needed to know about what was happening and what the right thing to do should be as laid down by God, because of course they were deeply Christian. But one of the things that I found really interesting is the theme that runs through it is that there has been something that has been lost during the Viking invasions, because he begins one of his pieces of writing by just saying England used to be a happy place, and then the Vikings arrived. And I found that fascinating because, of course, you get the echoes of it throughout the medieval era with the term Merry Old England, which continued on until the Victorians because it was a romantic ideal. And it, I think, gained its best popular culture representation in Tolkien and the Shire, who, of course, was a massive scholar, one of the premier scholars of Anglo-Saxon history, and clearly had modelled the hobbits on the small people of the Shires. And there's a kind of dual romanticism that comes out of English history after the Norman conquest. So, of course, the Normans becoming English kings, tremendous conquerors. If there's one major European success story in the Middle Ages, it's the Normans. And the massive success stories in the East from the Mongols and various other steppe nomads. But in the West, it's the Normans. And it's fortunate for the English that they had such energetic kings and capable kings, because what this allowed England to do is be an expansionist power. And that comes on the heels of the terrible struggles that the English suffered under the Viking invasion. And if there's one poem I would recommend, it's called The Wanderer. It's only about The Wanderer. This is the poem that Tolkien based Lord of the Rings on, and it's about a lone Anglo-Saxon man who has lost his friends and family and is now sailing across the rime-covered seas, lost and alone, and has nowhere to go. And it's the most sorrowful thing I've ever read in my life.
What were the qualities of Merry England then, Carl? I mean, I think of Falstaff and all of that, which of course is way later.
But it's the same. It's the same idea.
What is it then? What are those qualities?
It's about a kind of right ordering of the world. There is an appropriate way for the world to be ordered, and that involves a person at the top. It's hierarchical. There is a place for hierarchy in this, but there's also a strain of equality to it as well. And the idea of equality, the rule of law, so that the law that flows from the king himself should be subjected to, is actually quite an unusual thing when it first crops up. But it's present in the sort of oldest Robin Hood myths, where there's one myth where the king sneaks into Robin Hood's camp, and Robin Hood is dealing out justice, essentially. So the merry men that eat, they then engage in an archery competition. And if you miss by 3 fingers or something, you get a smack round the head. And, the first, Will Scarlet misses, Little John misses, and so Robin Hood smacks them. Then Robin misses, and so someone needs to smack him, and the king, in his secret, in his disguise, he's the one who smacks Robin Hood, and then the king misses, and then so Robin Hood smacks him. And it's very interesting how that's like a 12th century poem. This is very old. This is before Magna Carta. This is a very old concept that actually the rules should apply to everyone regardless of your station.
Yeah.
And that's a very deep moral principle that seems to have been and originated in England from this kind of view that the world should be ordered in a certain way that's fair to everyone. And one of the I think the most nourishing parts about it is that it's about letting people just live their lives. This is why the hobbits in the Shire seem so homely. They're not being interfered with by some central government. No, they're expected to just go and live their lives, be good people, have their relationships, enjoy themselves, work hard, obviously, so you've got lots to, enjoy, but, sing and dance and make merry and be happy. And that was what it seemed that it was all about.
Where could one find that now? I mean, I've made this point on this show a number of times, and I remember Rod Liddell really mocking me for it. This idea of fairness and one rule for all and everything seems to have been flouted, if that's the right word. It's probably not enough recently. I said, well, where is this sort of the English truculence about this? He said, no, it's kind of it's gone.
Yes.
Do you see any through line in the England of today with this past?
It's, I think, very deeply baked into our lizard brains. Right? It's because these things are unconscious, and so there are language, there are sort of habits of language that we still have that have this intonation that underpins it, but it's something that I think has been deliberately attacked during the 20th century because of the conquest of science over mythology, over religion, over romance, and that's failed, that project. There were many projects. There was a project that's called logical positivism. There was a philosophical project that was designed to have a value-free form of language, and that failed because it's simply not possible. All language seems to originate from an individual perspective, and then it's hard to devalue that, say that person has no interest and can't value anything. And so this project failed. And so, but what this ended up doing, I think, is opening the door to the sort of corporate speak that we have now. This kind of sanitized, politically correct, the sort of language that HR uses, and it's awful and it's dehumanizing. It's the kind of language robots would design, and we don't need to use it. We can actually use value judgments when we're describing a circumstance. And I think we're actually right to do so, because what we're doing when we allow them to get away with this kind of thinning of language is to present a neutral playing field, as if good and evil are the same. They're just two sides of the same coin. Who cares? No, there's a real effect when you allow them to present wrong as right and right as wrong. And in a more sensible world, just 100 years ago, the very words we would use to describe certain circumstances now would never have been used, and we would be using much more loaded terms such as deceit, betrayal, cruelty, wantonness. We would be using words that had judgments in them, and rightfully so. I mean, just look, the fact that the grooming gangs are still operating around this country is, I just can't imagine. Just go back 100 years. I mean, this is the same as Alfred looking at the Vikings raping and pillaging. It's no different. It's like, well, they're raping children. Yeah. And specifically English children. And if you speak to the victims of these grooming gangs, these victims will say, yeah, they're doing it because they think we're failed Christians, because we're English and we're not Christian. And so they don't respect us. And so they don't think that, they know that we've got no family and friends who are going to come for us. Because normally in a small English village, if a man were to steal away a child, a small girl, and rape her, you get a dozen men and go and deal with it. Yeah. But that doesn't happen now.
You mentioned there about using strong words like deceitful. there has been a flight from judgment, hasn't there? Generally?
Absolutely.
The worst thing you can say now to someone, which is sort of connected to what you're saying about grooming gangs too, actually, in a wider sense, is that you're judgmental, or as the Americans call it, judgy.
Yeah.
It seems to me that we have been we've been gifted with judgment. That's what makes us human beings, isn't it?
Well, I mean, this. So I think the problem is that we've been conditioned to essentially see ourselves as isolated individuals, devoid of significant relationships. And one of the main things, I think in, say, sort of 100 years' time, they'll look back and say, what? The government could say that you don't own your children. And that's mad. That's an absolutely mad statement, because I can't see how the government can have a claim to my children. They're mine. I own those children, and that's good for them because I love them. I want the best for them. I don't think the government cares about them at all, any more than they are numbers on a spreadsheet to the government. And so the importance and the primacy of these relationships are from where we draw our judgments. And it's how I feel you've behaved to me or I've behaved to you, and you can, and when if it's someone that you love and they say, well, you've betrayed me here, you've disappointed me, you've hurt me, then that's an emotional obligation and a pull on me. And it's nothing, we're way outside of the bounds of talking about science and reason now. Now we're talking about how we feel about things. And that's not wrong for us to be able to articulate this in a way that is powerful. This is what gets civilizations moving. This is what binds 100,000 men to Hannibal as he crosses the Alps. Yes. They have a relationship with him. They're not just signing a contract and be like, well, you're paying me 50 denarii a month or something, so I've got to do it. They're not doing that. They're doing it because they feel they have deep moral obligations. And this is why, like, when Caesar's army turns on him, or Alexander's army are like, we don't want to go any further into the Bosphorus. You can read Alexander's speech. It's been recorded. You can read it. It's deeply emotional. And he's saying that I went through this with you. I suffered every hardship that you suffered. And they say, well, you owe us. We want to see our families back in Greece. You owe us. And then Alexander turns back. So there's deep moral importance in the relationship that we have with each other. And these can be large numbers of people that have relationships. In fact, nations. There's deep moral importance in the national connections that we have. And one of these things that's under attack at the moment is the concept of banter between the British nations, between the English, Scots, and Welsh and Irish. That's a terrible thing, right? Because people don't seem to understand that these relationships are ancient. These relationships predate the arrival of Polynesians in the Polynesian islands. These relationships go back over 1,000 years. England was a United Nations in something like 950 and the Scots in like 860, something like this. And they've been neighbours ever since. And so and to the Welsh, of course, as well. And so if I make a joke about a Scotsman, that Scotsman can now go to the police and say, oh, this person said something racially aggravating to me. It's like, okay, now you've broken that bond, because there's always a reply. The Scot can always, he knows he's got a reply to an Englishman that he can just shoot back with, and I'm like, oh, okay, fair enough. And there's something that's created when you engage in this kind of banter. There's a kind of confirmation there. Because if I want to make a joke about a Scot, I need a Scot to be there. There's no point in me making a joke about the empty space where a Scot used to be. And so the way I view the world is that there should be a Scot there. And so that's confirmating. That's saying that you belong. And I, as the Englishman, I belong when you're making your joke back at me. And that's validating, and it gives you a reassuring way of understanding that, look, we understand each other. We have a shared language. Because, the Scot can't make that same joke against someone from Vietnam or something like that. They've got no relationship there. They don't know anything about each other. They've got no shared culture. They've got no shared expectations. So they're alien to one another. They're unsure. They don't know what to do.
But it's been deconstructed, but also sort of almost denied, isn't it? Sort of like this was not really ever the case. That's what I feel about a lot of the historical, retrospective reevaluation of our whole history, whether it's about migration to, Britain's a country of migrants, for example. This is just factually wrong. I mean, this is just factually wrong. Would you say you are a proud Englishman?
Absolutely.
As opposed to a proud Britishman?
Well, I think when you say Britishman sounds weird, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Yes,
it doesn't sound right.
I faltered rather there because I don't know what to actually.
Well, that's because that's not really a thing. British isn't an ethnic group; it's a civic identity. I think it's a valuable one, and I think it's good that we can have that open to everyone. But English is an ethnic identity, and I think it is wrong to try and take people's ethnic identities away from them. It's deeply disempowering. One of the things you're doing is severing the relations. If I'm not an Englishman, then a Scot can't make a joke about me. And if he's not a Scotsman, I can't make a joke about him. And I'm not confirmed in the reassurance that we know where we stand. And so now I'm isolated. I don't know him. I don't know his thoughts on me.
Yes.
And I don't know how I should behave in certain circumstances and how I should respond to jokes, or maybe I should take them as insults. Maybe I should be in a fight now. Maybe we should take up arms against you. Who knows? Banter is a way of making sure that everyone knows their place, and this is not just like casually being undermined or coming to the end of its natural lifestyle cycle. This is. We are suffering a direct siege on our culture from an enemy who is open about the fact that they want to abolish what we have. I mean, the most explicit example of this, in my opinion, is the decolonization movement in Oxford. How can you decolonize an English university? You, of course, can't. What this really is a de-Anglicization program of England. And so what this leads us to is a moral question that I don't think that the wider public are ready to answer, and that is, do the English as an ethnic group have a moral claim to England? And the left will say no. They will say no. They will say that the English don't exist, and if they do exist, they're evil, and we should abolish them. And I don't think that we should allow ourselves to be abolished.
The thing is that's the modern left.
Yes.
But like, if you think, we always press the levelers into action in these situations.
We do, yeah.
But even going right to Tony Benn, I would have thought there's a very strong sense of Jerusalem, a very strong sense of English.
There used to be. There absolutely used to be. And Jeremy Corbyn, I think, would have actually been the sort of tail end of that.
Yes, I know what you mean.
And it's a shame that the modern left, and just to be clear, the forces that are besieging our culture are entirely foreign, and they, again, are self-conscious. They begin, I think you could probably, they're a form of communism. And they've worked out at the end of the 19th century, the communists realized that the proletariat are not a revolutionary force. And that was greatly disappointing to them because, of course, Marx had said, well, look, the capitalist system will make the situation so unbearable, the proletariat will rise up and abolish it. And they'll bring about a socialist dictatorship that will wither away into a communist utopia. None of that happened. And it turned out that, in fact, rather than being a revolutionary force, the proletariat are actually the most far-right reactionary force going, because why wouldn't they be? It's their relationships that they're defending. It's their knowledge and connections with their friends and family and the place that they live in that they're defending. Of course they're not revolutionary. They live a nice life. They like their lives. They like the people they're around. They're not going to rise up. And they would only rise up against a tyrannical authority like a socialist regime. But it's very clear that this has gone through, it sort of branched out into Leninism, fascism, and then whatever you want to call the Frankfurt School, which then went to America and then ended up merging with a bunch of the postmodern French intellectuals like Foucault, Derrida, de Beauvoir, and this gestated in American universities and emerged as something called critical legal scholarship. And out of critical legal scholarship came something called critical race theory. And essentially, to summarize it very briefly, critical race theory seems to want, and I'm not an expert on it, I'm still studying it, but it seems to want parallel legal systems for different ethnic groups, which I think is an unacceptable prospect. I think there should be one rule, the rule of law, for all people in a given country. And I probably think that because I'm an Englishman. But I'm not going to move from that position. I demand it. I demand it.
How would you actually characterize yourself now, actually, politically? I mean, I know that this is, boring question number 64 probably, but I mean, is there a shorthand for what you would call yourself? Okay, so what's interesting is I wasn't really talking about politics before.
I was really talking about social life and how I see myself socially in relation to other social groups and in relation to individuals in those groups. And none of that required government intervention. You know, whenever I meet a Scottish friend of mine, we have lots of good banter, and I don't need the government to sign off on any of this. But how do I think that the world should be structured when it comes to politics? I actually very much agree with, frankly, the classical liberal ideal. I'm a constitutionalist. My sacred document is the Magna Carta. I went to the Magna Carta in Salisbury Cathedral when I was on my UKIP tour, in fact, and I found it amazing that it's not guarded. It's not guarded. You just walk in there. I could have just picked it up. And if I was someone who was a hater of English culture, I could go in there and burn it. It's an 800-year-old document. It's irreplaceable. There are the 4 in existence. And that's another miracle as well, isn't it? You know, imagine having 4 copies of a document that's 800 years old. 4 800-year-old documents. We should have these under lock and key. They shouldn't just be, you know. I mean, the lady who was there just showing people around was just, I mean, if something terrible had happened, she was, you know, she was a very knowledgeable old dear, but she wasn't going to be able to stop them. And so I came away from that thinking, well, I'm glad to have seen it. It's in Latin, so I couldn't read it. I'm glad I've seen it, but like, I'm concerned now because I know that there are these forces that will topple statues, that will try and destroy and desecrate our cultural heritage. But when it comes to like how politically, how do I see myself? I still see myself as a classical liberal. I think that we should have constitutional protections. I think that this should be for everyone. Each individual should have constitutional protections. I think there should be limits on government. I think there should be a delineation between the public and the private. And I think there are places there the government shouldn't be.
I mean, the reason I ask that is because obviously when one talks about traditions and such like, the general assumption is that is a conservative position. It doesn't have to be, but I think that is, I would say, the sort of general assumption.
Well, on that point, actually, can I make a point? Because it's very interesting you say that, because I'm sure you'll have noticed very radically left-wing people who absolutely fetishize the native cultures of other places. And they will go all around the world and say, well, look, this man with a bone through his nose, look at his beautiful tribal traditions. Are these not his heritage? Is this not, and that sounds like an incredibly conservative position. And it's like, okay, well, but I accept it. That's fine. I agree. You know, I mean, as long as he's not burning his wife alive or something, you know, when he wants or whatever, you know, because I am obviously a believer in human rights. So, you know, that's fine. You know, as long as it's not doing any particular damage. But why can't we apply that same standard to our own culture? Because actually we've got that here. You know, I mean, and foreigners absolutely apply that same standard. They, like, you can read what foreigners write about England in particular, and it sounds like a fairy tale country that you'd made up in a Lord of the Rings novel. It just sounds made up. But when you realise this is actually a real place, it kind of just makes me want to be the Englishman that foreigners think we are. You know, it makes me think, okay, well, I should probably live up to this. You know, this is a good standard. Again, the word standard, I think, is an important one that we don't think about, because the reason England is frankly better than other countries is because of these standards. And it goes right the way back to Alfred. Alfred didn't say, God, why have you done this to us? Alfred didn't be like, oh, it's those Vikings. No, Alfred's like, we did this. We did this. We are the ones who strayed from the path and we got what we deserved. And so we have to change. We'll improve ourselves. We will take responsibility. We will improve our standards. And all of English civilization has been about maintenance of high standards. And all I see now is an attack on these standards. Yeah. Because standards are very exclusive. And the whole point is exclusivity. Like this movement for total inclusivity. Well, why would you want that? Who wants anything that's open to everyone? You know, no one wants anything that's open to everyone. All of value comes from exclusivity. And the more exclusive it is, the more valuable it is. And so the higher your standards, the more difficult it is, the better the people that you get achieving the standards and therefore getting the position. This is what we would otherwise describe as a meritocracy. And again, all of these words, I'm sure you've heard them deeply under attack from the left. We have to defend them. They know what they're doing. They know that if they can destroy these standards, then they can essentially erase our culture, because these are the pillars of the culture. This is what holds up the sky as far as we're concerned. And we have to patrol this. We have to be on guard. Say, no, we're not prepared to drop these standards. And the assumption from the left as well is deeply, deeply racist, in my opinion, that foreigners can't abide by these standards. No, I think they can. I absolutely think they can. And what's more is I think they should. Is even more. It would be good for them to take from our example and follow these standards, because it's not like this was easy. It's not easy to uphold these standards, but it is good. It is an upward momentum. It makes you a better person. It makes the world around you better, and it stops you being envious and gross and violent and destructive. Look at what Black Lives Matter is. Just a movement built on envy to destroy what other people have. And what's worse is they're not even harming the billionaires. They're harming the small businessman who's like, yeah, I'm gonna get up early today. I'm gonna make sure that I get that shipment in and it's on the shelves, and we'll get people, and I'll make some money, and I'll have made the world a better place in my own small way. That's what's under attack right now.
You said we've got to be on our guard.
Yes.
About that. In your work, you're on air a huge amount of the time, aren't you?
Oh, yeah, a couple of hours every day, I suppose.
Okay, all right. Well, throughout that time, and also just, what is your perception? How many people are on their guard? Or do you think that it's...
Well, thankfully a lot, because the problem with, it is a problem, obviously, but a characteristic of left-wing ideology and activism is that it is totalizing. It is in all ways, in all aspects of life, something that is always itself on patrol for its own boundaries. So if you were to say something that's not controversial in any other respect, but if you're in a group that's doing sewing and knitting and stuff, and this is a real example actually, a real example of knitting, and the question of the definition of woman comes up, you say, well, there's a lady over there. Someone could say to you, well, how do you know that's a lady? Because I can see her. She obviously presents herself to be a lady, and I can see the biology that's underneath her clothes from the shape of her body, and so I know that's a lady. I say, yeah, but how do you know that doesn't identify as a man? And you haven't even asked their pronouns. And so suddenly, this knitting circle, on a totally trivial point, has become highly politicized and a nexus of this culture war. So there is nowhere that is outside of this. And so we have to be on patrol for it all the time as well.
I find, I don't know, you have this because when one does things on YouTube or is politically active, like you were, standing for election, 2019, wasn't it? The European election.
It was. Yeah. The European election we should never have had.
Yes. When you're doing those things, it can be a great outlet. But I would say that what's certainly happened to me is that, COVID aside, I find myself waking up in the morning thinking, well, okay, what thing that I've always loved is about to be
cancelled,
shot on from a big height. What thing that I always took for granted is no longer, and I will be thought the worst of it for taking it for granted, bit by bit by bit, all the time. Do you have that experience, or
every day? Every day. The first thing I do every day is get up and make sure that the online presence that I have is still there, because the sword of Damocles may have dropped overnight while I was asleep, and they may have just, because we have very little power over these decisions, and they can be made totally arbitrarily, and you've got no recourse. And honestly, it's a wonder that YouTube is. People always complain about YouTube's moderation, and I have plenty of complaints about it. But they are still the most permissive platform that we have. They are much better than Facebook's actually improving in this way, because I think Mark Zuckerberg, I've watched enough of his interviews to realize that he sees that what he's doing is very impactful, and he understands that, hang on, if you want to be a platform for everyone, unfortunately that means everyone, not just the progressives in California. But we are the Twitter has effectively become Mordor at this point. And so what the Twitter mob is the Eye of Sauron looking around for the ring. And the ring is whoever is being counter-progressive at the time. And so anyone who can get the attention of the Twitter mob to rile up a big anger, then the Eye of Sauron comes down on whoever that person is and destroys them. And so the trick is to try and avoid that.
What, just going back to that point, obviously I totally get the thing about YouTube, but in your own life, and what do you find when you wake up in the morning? You have to check that you're still on, but there are certain magazines I used to kind of read. I no longer do. There's certain obviously the papers, things like that. But even in, you mentioned knitting there.
Yeah.
It is the politicization, is it not, of everything?
All of society. There was an American historian called Robert Conquest.
Oh, yeah.
And you're probably familiar with his 3 laws of politics. I can't remember which law it was now, but one of them is, I think it's the second law, where it's any institution that's not explicitly right-wing will eventually become left-wing. And that is something that you can predict in advance. And so unless it is an explicitly right-wing organization, essentially just expect every organization or institution that you like and you're aware of to fall to leftism, because they will agree to the premises of left-wing ideology. And it's because, and I'm sad to say this, but it is true, that critical race theory and intersectionality are a product of classical liberalism as bastardized by Marxists. And they're explicit about this. There's a book that I recommend to everyone. It's insanely boring. It's a collection of academic texts from critical legal scholars who became the critical race theorists, called Critical Race Theory, the Key Writings That Formed the Movement. And in there, I can't remember which essay it was offhand, but they expressly say that what we'll do is we'll simply stretch the definitions of words in order to encapsulate their opposites, in order to ruin the foundations of the people that we're arguing against. So they will have to agree with our premises. And this is how we end up with words that are just totally bastardized. Like, there's, from the progressive perspective, if racism is institutional oppression, why would you ever call someone a racist? You're not an institution, you're a person. Unless you're an elected politician or something, or a functionary in a bureaucracy or something, there's no point calling anyone a racist. Because I'm just sat here on the bench, and I have an opinion, that you're a racist. You don't, how could I be? From your side? But from our perspective, of course, we believe that racism is a process. We believe it's something that someone believes and does to someone else. And of course, then we could be racists, of course. And of course, we oppose that idea, because why would you be? It's totally unfair. But yeah, so it's a deliberate attempt from within our own ideology by Marxists in order to bring about communism, frankly.
That's my next question, actually, because this is the point, isn't it, really? A lot of people say, cultural Marxism, this isn't really a thing. I don't even know whether you meant cultural Marxism.
Well, I don't use the term cultural Marxism because it's too loaded.
Okay.
But it is Marxist, and they are trying to affect the culture.
Yeah. So essentially going about the whole thing in a different way, but with the end result being exactly the same?
Yes. They just the liquidation of standards, the liquidation of barriers. Because again, we got to remember the communist ideal is that nobody owns anything and sits around as if they're in the Garden of Eden, picking fruit off the trees and presumably philosophizing and looking at the stars and thinking, and it's like, okay, but this is nonsense. This doesn't, that you don't produce a good civilization like that. There's a reason that mankind struggled to get out of that position, because as idyllic as it might sound, it's only idyllic until you break your leg, or until you get sick, or until your child is ill and dies, and then you realize, oh God, actually maybe all of the things that we struggled to develop to prevent all these things were actually a good thing in the first place. And really, I think this is based on a difference between English philosophy and continental philosophy in the Enlightenment. I mean, the English view is the Hobbesian view. Man's life is nasty, brutish, and short, and he's not very nice. This is why we need civilization, to civilize us. And the French view is very much Rousseau's view, which is man should never have put down the stakes that marked out the first plot of land, because that has society corrupts him, is the view of the French and the sort of continental philosophers. And again, the Marxists take this up completely and assume that people are just naturally good. It's like, I don't agree that they are. I think it takes a great deal. I actually very much agree with Aristotle on this. You have to be habituated into good behavior, into good morals. And you don't just pick them up on your own. You're not going to just invent them. They have to be something you work on and are conscious of. And I think the ancient Greeks knew that. I think the English knew that. And I think the French and the Germans are lying to themselves.
Do you think that you have to be consciously socialized into that belief? Do you think that has to come from a Christian belief? No. I mean, this like Aristotle predates Christianity, and and honestly, like I've recently been reawoken to the accuracy of Aristotle's understanding of what a human life requires, and I've been working on it very hard, and I've lost a huge amount of weight. I feel amazing. I feel like I'm a much better husband and father
for it, because it's just his view of virtue. It doesn't require any supernatural beliefs at all. It's completely secular.
So what did you have to jettison then? If you say it's about his idea of virtue, so what did you say I've got to change?
What I had to change is my view of materialism, because essentially, I think that the idea that we're purely materialistic is essentially the consequence of these logical positivists that I mentioned earlier. And I think that view has fallen out of favor, both in the academy and in kind of like in online circles, I'll say. Because there's quite a few Christians online who are like actually gaining some ground, because they're like, hey, I've got a sort of metaphysical view of the world here, and it's doing me some good. And Aristotle's presenting a metaphysical view of the world, and it's thankfully a secular one, and I'm happy to adopt it because it's right that the thing I liked about Aristotle is the way he conceives of the four kinds of man. So you've got the vicious man, who is an evil man and enjoys being evil. No one wants to be that man. Then you have the incontinent man, who is evil but doesn't really want to be. And then you have the continent man, who is good but doesn't really want to be. And you have the virtuous man, who's good and wants to be. Yeah. And it's actually in relation to diet that I actually think this is a really useful framing, because my wife is in the same position as I am, but she doesn't adopt this kind of thinking. So she's on the diet that she hates, and she has to grin and grit her teeth and just go through. I'll just have my bowl of salad. And but I chose a different diet to her. I'm on the keto diet, and so basically you're not allowed sugar or carbs, and that sounds terrifying, right? It sounds terrifying. But then I realized that actually I can still have quite a lot of the foods I like. I can still have bacon and cheese, and so you're getting sugar-free chocolate, and so it's not so bad. But then you start to like the results, and then you realize, oh no, I actually find the sugar and the carbs kind of disgusting. You end up developing a kind of disgust response to them, and so you love not having the bad things. You love having good things, and so in the realm of the diet, in Aristotle's view, you kind of a virtuous diet, engaging the virtuous diet, and it really seems to work. And oh my god, it's warm here.
Yes,
no, it's the heat.
We are in a very, very hot day while we're doing this.
Yeah. But yeah, and so that again, no God required. But the idea that there's something about yourself that is actually a bit sacred, and there's a kind of way of entering into a state of affairs. And again, a diet's actually a really good way of looking at this, because when you break your diet, you know that you've done something wrong, because you set yourself a task. You're going to get to a sort of end state. And to do that, you have to be in a particular condition, a state of affairs where you haven't eaten this, you haven't done that, you've done some exercise, you've got boundaries, you've got an order that you've created. And while you're doing the right thing, the order exists, and you know it exists. But then when you get that donut and you eat that donut, you've broken it, and you know you've broken it, you've defiled it. Yeah. And that's so there is something there that is that is slightly sacred. It's not related to God or anything. It's related to your own opinion of yourself. But there is something that you've created, and I think that this is important. This is the sort of essence of what our relationships are. It's like marriage, particularly, right? So if you cheat on your wife, then you knew that you had an agreement with your wife that you've created a state of affairs when you get married. This is exclusive. It's me and you, and that's going to be for all time. And then when you break that can never be repaired. There will always be the knowledge of that betrayal that's even if you can work past it, it'll never be the same as it was. And so the question really is one of prudence. It's like, look, you have to accept, you know that that's the case. You have this kind of sacred thing that's been created. Are you prepared to break it? And that's something that you have to think about.
Carl, when we were talking about, basically how one lives one's life privately, if you like, personally, and also how one's beliefs inform your life. You did stand, as I said, for election, so that was actually taking it a step further, actually, and hoping to represent what people with what you believe. What, as an experience, was it like for you? Did you enjoy it?
I loved it.
You loved it?
I loved every second of it.
Oh, really?
There was a strange confusion within UKIP at the time. And now I'm not an expert on the inner workings of the party politics or anything like that. And I don't want anyone to think that I'm speaking ill of anyone there, because I very much liked everyone that I met. But I was obviously coming into something that had a deep series of relationships entwined in it, and people had personal grudges and things like this and all this sort of stuff. And so I tried to avoid all that. And I was just like, right, okay, what can I do? So I've always, I guess my dad has always told me, look, do something, work, do something, move, don't just sit on your ass, get something done. And one of the problems I found was that nobody was really campaigning with UKIP. When this came along, I just said to my team, we only had like two of us, me and two other chaps. I was like, do you guys fancy doing something? And they're like, yeah, okay, we'll do like the Southwest tour. Yeah. And so it was just this amazing, like, energetic thing that we got to do, whereas everyone else seems kind of like blinking in the light and be like, oh God, we've got an election. And I mean, I knew we were never going to win, because I mean, Nigel Farage was running parallel to us, against us, and he was Mr. Brexit. There's no way we were going to win, but we could do some interesting things, maybe change some minds and cause a bit of a stir, which I think we successfully did.
Did you enjoy the whole speaking aspect of it?
It was wonderful. Yeah. So it was a great adventure because we didn't know what we were going to find, and so in some small towns we had not just small towns, in some cities, like in Plymouth we had 500 people turn up to see us in the middle of the day, just in Plymouth, and so that was huge. It was a lovely day. It was like Monday afternoon or something like that, and so getting 500 people out on a Monday afternoon seemed like a big deal to me. But then in 500. Some places like Totnes, we were met with a very large and angry crowd of insufferable middle class left wing prats, and they had their like, oh, refuse fascism, refuse fascism. It's like, what are you talking about? We're here for Brexit. We want to leave the fascists, if that's okay with you. And I remember having some fantastic conversations. I had a conversation with one woman, and she went off angry at me. And then this chap who was literally stood next to her said, "Well, I just think you wouldn't platform a woman." I was, not engaging their brains. They're engaged in virtue signaling and trying to desperately make it look like, oh, I'm so good and left wing, and it's like, yeah, is there good in the left wing though? I'm struggling to see it.
Would you do it again? I mean, I don't necessarily mean for UKIP. I mean, at all. I mean, would you stand for elected office?
I think I would probably save my wife the headache of it.
Really?
Because I mean, if it was just me, if I was a single man, yes, definitely, because it was great fun, and I enjoy going and talking to all of these people and doing all of this stuff, and it was exciting. It was really exciting and really gratifying as well. And you get to speak to a huge range of people that you just don't expect are out there, and it was really fun. And I guess there's something in me that enjoys being a showman as well. See, when you're going back and forth with the left-wing activists who are never very well educated in their own subject, but when it came to the very end of the tour, I think it was in Exeter, the left-wingers they had their chants. They've got this cult-like chants that they have, and one of the chant leaders was just saying, "Don't talk to him. He's a professional. You won't win." It's like, oh, okay, I'll take that as a compliment. Thank you very much. But I was very proud of that. I mean, I knew we weren't going to win or anything, so we just had a good time with it. And I got Milo Yiannopoulos across, a very controversial man, but he's a good friend of mine, and he came over and he did a brilliant job with the crowd, because again, he's a natural showman. So it was just a tremendous fun thing. But I think we're in a different political environment now. Yeah. Where I think that the tensions are too high. I think the left have extended themselves so far that they're afraid of losing, because they do know that they're vulnerable in certain areas, and they will absolutely come down as hard as they can on anyone that they feel is threatening their hegemony. And so I think at the moment what we have to do is kind of retire and encourage them to overextend, encourage them to fail on their own terms, because they absolutely will. Every left-wing project ends in tears and bloodshed. And so we have a kind of, not a leave of absence, because that's not the right term, but there's a kind of bit of breathing room at the moment, because the left are electorally terribly weak. And in America, people are becoming aware that the parents are rising up against critical race theory in their schools. They're going to start, doubtless, replacing school boards and things like this in at least Republican areas. For some reason, the Democrat areas are totally fine with just pure racism being taught. But in Britain, we have people voting Conservative. Not that we have a Conservative government, but we have people voting Conservative. And so the culture is not going in the left's favour. And in fact, recently, I think it was Nesreen Malik wrote an article in The Guardian lamenting this, saying, well, why are we losing the culture war? Why are the right winning the culture war? They don't know. They don't know what it is that makes people, that animates them, that gets them to do the things they do. They don't understand because they've spent their entire lives, and for generations now, theorizing abstractly in academia rather than being among people and living lives with them.
Yeah. You know? You influence a lot of people.
So.
There's no question about that. What's the next sort of logical stage, really, Kai, in that? Because you have this enormous presence. I mean, you're one of the British pioneers. There's no question about that.
Oh, thank you.
Where does it sort of go in your mind? Where would you go?
Well, I think one of the purposes behind lotuseaters.com is that it's an intellectual project, because one of the things that conservatives are terrible at is theory. Where are they? Where are the conservative theorists? I mean, doubtless you can name dozens and dozens and dozens of left-wing theorists, but the conservatives have got this great dearth. I mean, when Roger Scruton died, everyone was like, okay, well, that's conservatism over. Why is he the only one? Why is there only one conservative theorist, examining what the conservative view of the world is? And since there seems to be this vast gap in the market, I suppose I'll probably end up trying to write a book and saying, well, look, I think that there's actually, this is what I can see, and I think that this is what it might be valuable to people, and hopefully this will influence conservative politicians to actually be conservative, because I think that would be the ideal thing, because it doesn't take much to be able to say, well, hang on a second, like, why is mass immigration bad? Why is that the case? I mean, for example, the left will say, but these people are here to, and I've met immigrants. Well, the last haircut I got was from a guy from Turkey. It's like, why are we accepting immigrants from Turkey? Why do they come here? And he was like, I'm here to live out my dream. And it's like, this isn't some frontier country that's unexplored. There's not the American West. This is a very ancient country that's currently struggling under the burden of millions of new arrivals. And we don't know what to do with them. We don't know how to integrate them. And they're forming what are effectively colonies on our soil. We need to talk about this. We need to be able to say, well, no, look, we don't hate you or anything, but you've got to understand, you've got to become familiar and normal, and you've got to act in the sort of way that the English act. You've got to understand, we're happy to incorporate you, but we've got to be able to articulate that that's a necessary thing to happen. But we've also got to examine the reason why we're allowing these people in. Now, the Labour government under Tony Blair would say things like, oh, it's good for the economy. I don't care about the economy. That's what, you just shut down the country for a year. Don't tell me about the economy. You don't care about the economy, right? And then what's worse, though, is, okay, well, it's good for the economy. You're going to have, like, ethnic foods everywhere. Oh, wonderful. So essentially what we're saying, and these people will be able to, make their lives better, it's like, okay, but these are material reasons. These are mercenary reasons. They're here to make money for us and for themselves. So I don't know if that's wise. I don't know if that's really what we're talking about. Because especially if you take this kind of relational view of the world, and, okay, so England's a very old place with these very old relationships. Well, a lot of them have been sundered. I mean, where are the Cockneys now? Because when I was growing up, I knew that parts of London were the Cockney parts of London. I believe they've all fled to Essex now. So they're currently living in exile, away from what I guess we can call their homeland. It's like, well, are we never going to talk about that? Are they just going to be like, oh, sorry, Cockneys. Sorry, Sadiq Khan's London is here now. You don't get a say in any of this. It's like, that just seems cruel to me. And I don't think we'd accept it for any other group outside of Britain.
Oh, no. It'd be positively, as you said earlier, celebrated. I mean, the thing is, as well, is that when you're arguing with people about, say, like immigration, they will suddenly move the goalpost. So if you're talking about economics, they will, well, actually, no, it's usually when you're talking about cultural things. They'll suddenly start, yes, but what about this? No, steady, wait a minute. One thing at a time, Economics, fine. The cultural effect is this, that, and the other, which is never talked about, really. It really, we had a great guy on called Michael Collins, who wrote a book called The Likes of Us, all about the white working class in London. He did one of our documentaries. Excellent, but that is the exception that proves the rule, I think. Well, look, we've been sitting here drenched in sweat, but
it's a shame about the weather, but
it's such a pleasure, actually.
Well, thank you.
And I mean, I do hope that you will come back again.
I would love to.
Really do, to our humble place, and and all the very best with Lotus Eaters. It's lotuseaters.com.
Yes.
Right. I think it's a fascinating project you've got going there. I mean, all these little history capsules too, and everything.
But it's also just, I really think we need to engage in a kind of laboratory of ideas. What is it that we're doing? Who are we? Where do we want to go? What do we want? You know, and so we're very open to, and we've got lots of very well qualified people. Everyone there has got much better qualifications than I do, which was remarkable. I didn't realize I'd have people with master's degrees applying for jobs and things like this, PhD students and things like that. But no, it's very interesting. Like,
and do you do written work on it too?
Yeah, written work, articles, videos, direct videos, sort of scripted videos. You know, we do lots of sort of stuff.
And the book you mentioned, that is something in your mind, is it at the moment, or is that you actually thinking, next year I might put by to write it?
Well, I'm developing what I think is essentially a kind of metaphysics of the English, and I think it needs to be done. I don't see anyone else doing it, and there are lots of things I have to read in advance of doing this, because I've got a bunch of books on my shelves. Because 100 years ago, you would get English professors writing books about Englishness, and they're very thick books, and I need to be able to find the time to put it aside. But at the moment, I'm doing the critical race theory stuff, so I just haven't had the time. But in a couple of years, I expect I'll write it. In a couple of years.
Right. We'll look forward to that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Benjamin. That's it for this week. Please don't forget to subscribe, will you? And we shall see you next time. Thank you very much. Bye.